Thank you, John. The few, the proud, the people who are still here. I usually speak extemp, and I'm probably a little too formal here, but I'm actually going to read a little bit. Very happy to be here. I'm going to read in the interest of clarity. This is actually sort of some of my current thinking, probably encapsulating a lot. I'm going to try to be brief. It's been a fascinating day, a bit of a long day. So I, however, should warn you that I fail at being brief. So I hope you're comfortable. You deserve this. I want to sketch three movements in thought, or more vaguely in a complex of ideas, centered around the concept of the state. Or, as the Germans might put it, I want to trace the wanderings of the zeitgeist as it imagines what it is to do politics. I'm going to be focused on the North Atlantic, the EU and the US especially. The picture is different in other places, of course, which is why we have WAIS. I should also say it's a great honor to be speaking at the Golden Jubilee. WAIS was founded in 1965, the year of my birth, and a year before the Super Bowl. So I feel a certain kind of kinship here. But in my remarks today, I'm only going to go back a long generation to the early 90s. Maybe you remember the early 90s. The Cold War ended. Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. People talked about the end of history, by which Fukuyama meant not the end of events, but the hegemony of a certain idea of liberal modernity. Intertwined with the end of the Cold War was the emergence, or perhaps the fashionability, of something called globalization. Conferences were held and books were written, and I too was guilty of this. There was even a WAIS conference right here on globalizations, as we heard in the last presentation. Now, globalization meant a lot of things at the time, but one of the things it meant was that the state, both as a form of political organization and as a nation, the governance of a distinct place, Spain or South Africa or what have you, didn't mean as much as it once did. As Tim was talking about, as Anthony was talking about. Goods, people, information, and especially money could move as never before, and so specific places were less important. By extension, the governments of such places, nation states, were less important. So there was even wild-eyed talk about the end of the state, that history had somehow moved beyond this nation state that had dominated social life, at least in the heart of Europe, for centuries. And considering that the state had been the vehicle for episodic genocide and perennial subjugation, many people thought the decline of the state to be a promising development. And nowhere was this sense of a seismic shift in the nature of political life itself more strongly sensed or more loudly welcomed than in Europe. Recall that the European project, going back to its establishment by the Rome treaties, grew out of concern for the horrors wrought by modern states, especially Germany. This, incidentally, is my first book. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty creating the European Union was signed. So suddenly the European project seemed close to some sort of definitive fruition, resulting in what Jacques Delors, then president of the Commission, once dubbed an unidentified political object. The shape of this project, however, stubbornly remained vague. Treaties, ECJ decisions, countless talk gave rise to more and more Europe, but not much clarity, that silly Enlightenment virtue. It was widely said at the time that Europe was sui generis. Even then, as a young student, I thought that sui generis was a little unsatisfying by way of political understanding. Even if there's only one of them, can we say what makes this UPO new? Be that as it may, on both the global and European level, there was a sense of more than ordinary historical change, a sense that the nature of politics itself was being transformed, from the national in particular to the global and integrated, network, systemic, and things like that. From German to European, to take an especially important and not exactly accidental instance. Or to put it differently, and it was often said at the time, the world seemed to be moving in sundry areas of life from a style understood as modern to something struggling to be born, the not yet positively named that was therefore merely called postmodern. Whatever that might in due course reveal itself to be. So that seemed to be the state of play in its broad swaths of intellectual life at the end of the 1990s. And then things started happening. Most dramatically, the 9/11 attacks thrust the United States into what was almost immediately called the global war on terror. Integration might be nice, but there's really nothing like a large nation state to wage large-scale ideological conflict. Note that not only was the US government back in the spotlight as a central and very national political actor, Ideological conflict, supposedly buried with the fall of the Berlin Wall, was back with a vengeance and is with us still. In Europe, the concept of the state resurfaced more subtly, but perhaps even more decisively. In 1999, the euro was established as a single currency for many states comprising the eurozone. The euro was conducted by the European banking policies, monetary policy was conducted by the European Central Bank, based in Frankfurt. And in order to join the currency, member states were obliged by treaty to harmonize their economies. So we see a project of widespread conformity in order to create a unified space administered by a highly bureaucratic central authority. Sounds sort of familiar, much like the history of France. Things get more interesting still. In 2008, financial issues in the United States spin out of control. A global financial crisis, also called the Great Recession, ensued. It was very good for me professionally. Responding to the crisis, the U.S. government nationalized or forcibly transferred huge institutions, printing money is necessary. Other governments around the world did much the same thing. Here again, the state seemed not irrelevant, but suddenly indispensable to making globalization work. In Europe, Dexia and Fortis, which were banks that had been encouraged to do business across member states, suddenly found themselves on the brink of insolvency. There was at the time no European process to resolve such banks, and so the banks turned to their national governments. Spending taxpayer money, the national governments rescued the bank operations within their own borders. I was flown to the commission to discuss what this meant. At least to some, this train of events casts an odd light on the European project. When times are good, we talk about integration. But when the chips are down, the Europeans turn back to their states. And we've heard variations of this claim ever since, especially with regard to the Greek crisis. Which is not to say that the European project didn't and doesn't have its supporters. Supporters such as my acquaintance Nicholas Ferran, or Phil or WAIS or Angel, and I'm calling that to bother John Vinas, strenuously argued that the problem was that Europe didn't have a true banking union with the resources to resolve banking crises at the European level. Europe has since established such a union, but a more general lesson emerges. The problems within the Eurozone should be addressed by more intense processes of European integration. Now, for present purposes at least, this may in fact be the case. It's not my point here. What I want to emphasize, however, is that more Europe means, in effect, shifting legal and regulatory authority to the European plane, shades of the New Deal in the United States. Whether or not that's the right thing to do, the political imagination at work seems to be fundamentally national. That is, what is strongly implied by supporters of the European project at this juncture is another continental state. That is, the state seems to be the horizon for a constitutional thought. So the state is hegemonic in the sense of authoritatively shaping how we seem to be able to think about serious politics. That is, I'm rather unhappily making a kind of end of history argument of my own. For a while, the 90s, we promised ourselves a new kind of politics, but it didn't really happen, despite my books to that effect. So if the first wave I wanted to talk about was anticipation of something beyond the state, running through the 90s, the next decade saw the resurgence of the state as the fundamental form of political, or at least institutional thought, a kind of hegemony over the imagination. So this creates a rather unpleasant paradox. On the one hand, the state is passé. On the other hand, the state evidently cannot be passed. It bears remembering that globalization and integration across politics didn't go away. Weakness in China just appears to have motivated the U.S. Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, and so forth. And for my own purposes, at least for the purposes of political philosophy, if not institutional construction, I stand by my own articulation of global capitalism as a form of political life, which I call the city of gold. But the city seems to work by changing the meanings of older institutional forms rather than creating new forms of institutional life. This contradiction, an understanding of the state which is not generally credible, plausible, but which is also necessary, has led to a kind of decadence, a sort of false consciousness. We think and speak in a Republican vocabulary, but the grammar, the internal logic is gone. We don't really believe our stories, not even as metaphors. So, to give a better sense of what I mean, let me suggest 3 areas in which the modern state's decadence is advanced. First, and most obviously, consider electoral politics in the United States. The Democratic ideal, Bush v. Clinton in a battle of the brands stretching across generations, has been upended by the current circus of Republican candidates. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has insisted that spending money pretty much is the core of democratic discourse, even over the objections of the literature. And the media, for its part, needs to feed a 24-hour news cycle. Fortunately, politics can be treated like sports, and it's almost as engrossing as football. We don't talk about issues. See, I really am akin to this Super Bowl thing. We don't talk about issues nearly so much as we talk about advantage. And like fantasy football, that talk can be extended indefinitely. How long have we been in this presidential election? At some point, all of this becomes simply unserious, not in terms of people's lives. Do we go to war, raise interest rates, or what have you, remain serious issues, but in terms of a project of collective self-governance. So I'm trying to make my peace with that personally. The US is the third largest nation on the planet, fourth if we treat the EU as a single country. And Rousseau taught us to be skeptical of the idea that large groups of people could reach rational consensus or even fellow feeling. Where the US has chosen celebrity, the EU has chosen bureaucracy as the key modality of post-enlightened political life. So a number of countries simply reject the somewhat nationalist idea of a European constitution. No problem. We will simply renegotiate the substance of the Constitution as the Lisbon Treaty, decided among professionals and virtually unreadable. In Europe, the enlightened idea of politics has not been subverted by some reversion to the pre-modern, a return of the repressed as was long feared. Maybe in Serbia. Nor has it been subverted by carnival, as in the United States. Instead, we get just the opposite, the extension of texts, endless texts, until nobody knows. And rationality, at least publicly accessible rationality, is no longer on the table. So politics, in the narrow sense of official governance, is the first area in which we easily observe what I'm calling the decadence of the enlightened, democratic, republican, modern, and yet nonetheless indispensable state. A second, but perhaps even more important to this group, area of life that I would say suffers from the decadence of the state would be the university, understood as an ideal. In the countries where the modern university was founded, the nation framed the deep structure of elite imaginations, and in so doing, made a certain kind of liberal education, which most of us here enjoyed, and by extension politics, and by extension law, thinkable. Study the classics and administer India, I like to quip. But the point was that an ideal of the English gentleman, or the German or the American, underwrote what used to be called liberal education. That set of understandings, what sort of leading citizens does a particular society need, and how do we build such citizens, has waned. It no longer gives the bureaucratic university, operating in a global frame, its sense of purpose, of meaning. We certainly don't look at the university as transmitting any specific culture. That would be elitist, parochial, and generally politically unsound. Indeed, we, and I'm guilty here too, engage in a global competition for paying students. We call it internationalism. Which makes education substantively unimaginable, at least to our administrators, who are less speaking of excellence, which is defined in terms of competitive comparison, which must be thought to contribute to brand, that is, the intellectual equivalent of widgets. Lyotard saw this coming back in the 70s when he discussed the fate of the university in postmodern, meaning post-national, among other things, terms. So here's a third area of decadence. In a world where law equals the nation, where law flowed from the idea of the nation, one could idealistically, even radically, going back to the evolution, to the effort to outlaw prior to World War I and then after World War I, speak of law among nations, or law even against the nation, the subject and the object of public international law, which I also teach. Law in this world could be an idealistic project, ending wars, redeeming history, and maybe even a rather silly substitute for religion, also called human rights. That is, for international law, the state was the problem, and there was much talk for 100 years or more of getting beyond it, getting somehow beyond Westphalia, world government, citizens of the world, etc., etc. But such talk took place, mostly unself-consciously, in an imaginary political life that was itself profoundly republican. So the international law project, envisioned in a world of united nations, stress on nations, could be expanded with a kind of tractable difficulty that lawyers like myself love, to include international organizations, international human rights, respect for peoples and trade of goods, Indeed, at least under these conditions of globalization after World War II, consider the United Nations and the GATT and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights all passed at the same time. Perhaps the domain of international law had to be expanded, ultimately producing a map of human relations on the planet. We'll focus sort of just done again. But it's also a map of nothing. The effrontery of it all. 132 members of the International Law Association claim to speak for the planet, along with a handful of judges deciding a few cases a year. Meanwhile, in the academy and elsewhere, public international law is viewed as marginal, but in a nice way, like bird watching. But it gets worse. The map appears to lie quite a bit. Right? Ideas that are very common in international law that start with equality are very rare in the world. And so in the US and other countries, we've routinized assassination, for example. Doesn't really fit in that whole human rights thing, but what the hell? Is that not our law too? Mass migrations. History on the march, as we bookishly recite the various rights of what to do with the people who survive, and whom we have a responsibility to protect, no doubt. Banking practice is probably doing more to make the world, certainly in Europe, but it's not international law in any traditional sense, though it's omnipresent, and Lord knows Basel has failed. Banking is not even mostly law, or alternatively, if you prefer, it's all law, but of oligarchy and beyond the pale of polite discourse, which is going to make liberal presumptions. So to be as clear as I can, I am not saying, in traditional realist fashion, that international law doesn't constrain states who somehow have a pre-existing and unlegally defined stateness, and therefore international law is not law. I'm not making that old argument. I'm saying that in a bureaucratic, capitalistic, globalized society where Chinese asset bubbles deter US monetary policy, defined across vast numbers of people at distance, law is everywhere. Think of Delaware corporations, which I also teach. And it's everywhere international. So there's nowhere obvious for a discrete field, the international, to stand. No conceptually independent state, we the people formed into groups, against which international law can imagine itself without vacillating wildly between the actions of tiny elites and relatively small institutions, and a simply unbelievable set of claims to be vaporously the law of international life, that is, of human life. So to quip, globalization has made specifically international law almost unthinkable. To put the matter somewhat anthropologically, if we understand law as the formalized understandings of increasingly globalized societies, including states that think of themselves as truly excellent, then international law simply doesn't articulate much of contemporary life. It may indeed be law, but it is at best law at the outer gate. The real law lies deeper. Or to put it polemically, international law is over for the same reason that liberal education is over. The soul of the enterprise lived in a profoundly nationalist, liberal Republican imagination of public life. That imagination no longer obtains in the relevant quarters. This, too, is what postmodern means, or as I said, decadence. So let me conclude. One should take all this with a grain of salt. I don't want to be a downer right before happy hour. I'm getting really dry here. But something has passed. We won't see another Lincoln or De Gaulle. And other ways of living together are struggling to be born. So perhaps international law is not the dream that it once was. Perhaps it's a way of organizing moral discourse in a superficially secular way, or at least of justifying the actions of the powerful in more or less populist, if not actually democratic fashion. Perhaps the university isn't the institution of light and truth, but a jobs program and a place to form identity. And it does create spaces for people to think. Sinecures. I certainly appreciate my status, marginal though it is. Turning to politics, elections and such, just maybe we should tend our gardens while bemusedly observing our guardians. Self-governance has had a good run, but it has not been the norm during human history. And we do still vote, and it still does mean something. I've overstated the case in the interest of provocation. More importantly, surely life in the City of Gold has its pleasures, including the ability to communicate so easily with others. So let's be thankful for WAIS. And for the rest, we shall come to know. Thank you.